Today's horror story is written by Epyrus. Escondido, California, one of the oldest cities in San Diego County, with its closest neighbor being Elfin Forest, nestled in the foothills of the Santa Rosa Mountains, known for its myths of being haunted, for its history with the local Diegano tribes and the Romani people that used to occupy the area in the early 19th century, who ran into inevitable conflict with the local townspeople, who drove them out and slaughtered those that remained behind. Legend has it that they cursed the forest and its surrounding lands in answer to the massacre. Locals are brought up on these tales and hear them just as seriously as law. Outsiders that move to the city do not always hold respect for these tales, even if they do not believe them. Are you going to just keep staring at everything, or are you going to pack? A light, sweet voice broke me from my thoughts, blinking a few times to clear my blurring vision. I had noticed that I'd spaced off. Looking up to the other side of the kitchen aisle, a set of amber fire eyes looking at me behind a steaming mug of coffee. Messy brown curls framing her soft and delicate features. Every time I looked at her, I couldn't help but fall in love all over again. My eyes fell to her hands wrapped around her mug, slender fingers and naturally sun-kissed skin. A smile tugging at the edge of my lips when my eyes settle on the simple golden band with 3 stones set in it around her ring finger, a small chuckle leaving my lips. I was just going over the list in my head, making sure I have everything. Is that so? Is that why you've been staring at that waterproof notepad for 20 minutes? I couldn't help but let out a breathy sigh that mixed with a chuckle. Always so intuitive, or maybe she could just see through my bullshit. Honestly, it's probably both. Looking down to the kitchen island countertop, my empty hiking pack by my feet resting against the cupboards. It wasn't my first trip up to the Elfin Trails. However, it would be my last, at least for a long while. Looking down to the checklist in front of me, I see that everything I had written down had been checked off, from the first aid kit to the extra pair of socks, to the 2 days worth of food, to the handheld satellite GPS tracker in case of emergencies. I picked up my empty pack and laid it on the countertop, carefully picking up each of my items, putting an extra change of clothing into the waterproof compartment. The sound of a porcelain mug being placed on the marble countertop brought me out of my mundane packing trance. A gentle hand touched the side of my face, turning me to face those beautiful amber fire eyes. Her hand found my own and guided it down to her abdomen, my hand gently placing itself on her belly. 7 months in, 2 to go. The action instantly quelled my mind and stilled my body. I took a small, calming breath, and a small smile grew on my face. If you're having second thoughts, William, you don't have to go. You know he wouldn't blame you. I have to, Ellie. He always told us that when he passed, he wanted his ashes spread at the Harmony Grove overlook. It's the least I could do. My love, you cannot blame yourself, but I understand if you need to do this for him. Not only for him, though, but for yourself. You need closure, and I'm glad we're doing this now before the twins get here. I couldn't help but smile. She always understood. It was one of the many things I adored about her. I shouldn't be any longer than a day. If for any reason I'm longer than that, my sister's number is on the fridge along with the forest ranger's number. I'll be parking my truck at the Del Dios Highway parking. Okay, my love. And hey, take some pictures for me, okay? I chuckle, nodding. Of course, I've got the camera packed and everything. Once everything was packed, I moved towards the front door. Sitting on the bottom steps leading up to the stairs, I put on my boots. The only boots I've worn for the better part of a decade, that still had overseas soil caked into the soles, boots that have carried me through sand and mud, forests and roads. Tying up the laces, I look up to see my wife standing, leaning against the wall beside the door, watching me, a hand supporting the underside of her belly. I lift a hand and motioned her to come over. A warm smile appeared on her face as she made her way over to stand in front of me. I placed my hands on either side of her belly, placing a feather-light kiss to it before resting my forehead against her, humming softly at the flutter of kicks that all but assaulted my forehead. Don't worry, little ones. Daddy will be home before you know it. I stand slowly, pulling my wife into a sweet and soft kiss. I love you, all three of you. I'll see you soon. The moment I stepped out of my house, I got a feeling. It was a strange, eerie feeling that settled in my chest, which only seemed to grow the further I got from my home. Walking up to my 1980 Chevy Silverado, the same truck my late father had driven around when I was a kid, opening the door and chucking my pack into the passenger seat before lifting myself up and behind the wheel. Sitting in the truck now, though, since he's passed, it's like sitting with a ghost. When I look to the passenger seat, I almost expect him to be there. Putting the keys in the ignition and turning the engine over, it sputtered to life loudly. Popping it into reverse and pulling out of the driveway, waving to my wife who stood in the doorway, waving my goodbye before putting it into gear and heading down the road. The sound of gravel under rubber tires filled my ears as I pulled into the parking area just off the highway, coming to a stop with a high-pitched whine from my brakes. Turning off the ignition and rolling out my window before grabbing my pack from the passenger seat, dragging it with me, and setting my pack against the front tire before closing the door, the sound it made akin to a hollow thud, the side mirror shaking slightly with the force, closing my eyes for a moment. Shit. Sorry, Pops. I stopped my train of thought with a sad sigh, realizing that there would be no response. Clearing my throat and locking up the truck, patting the side of my pack, affirming that I had my water bottle and a set of walking sticks. Though I may be 32 years old, you can never go wrong with a set of walking sticks. The sun was already well on its way up into the sky. Currently 8 a.m., 9 degrees Celsius. Not too cold, but enough to be able to wear my cotton sweater comfortably without getting too warm. Walking over to the entry path into the forest, I didn't pause crossing over into the boundary of the reserve without a second thought. The sound of loose dirt and rocks being displaced by the soles of my boots with each step. It was going to be a long walk to the overlook. The hike up to the overlook was peaceful and quiet. People were scarce on the trails during the early mornings, or maybe it was just my luck, having only run into one other person before reaching the peak. A middle-aged woman, likely native to these parts. She had given me a warm smile and a tilt of her hat as she passed before we went along our way. Approaching the overlook, there was a small structure, a set of benches back to back with each other, the wood old and weathered from the elements, a thin metal sign pinned to the wooden frame facing the trail that read, "Welcome to Harmony Grove Overlook," in simple white letters. Listening to the sound of the dirt under the weight of my boots, I walked over to the forwardmost bench overlooking the deep-hilled valley. Before sitting down, I paused, looking at the bench. Someone had carved into the wood, TKD. I was compelled to brush my fingers along the carved marks before I undid the chest and waist strap of my pack. Shrugging it off my shoulders and sitting down, resting my pack against my legs as I took off my baseball cap. Running a hand through my hair soaked with sweat, setting my hat down for only a moment, grabbing the hem of my sweater and pulling it up over my head. The slight warm breeze hitting my bare arms causing me to sigh constantly, folding up my sweater and opening up my pack. Stuffing it inside carefully after I grabbed the small Ziploc baggie of roasted peanuts, grabbing my bottle of water and setting it on the right side of me, reaching to my left to pick up my hat. pausing when all I felt was the wood of the bench. Looking over, the bench was clear. Where I had placed my hat was no longer there. I frowned, setting my bag of peanuts down by my water and getting up to my feet. Looking around under the branches, stepping back after a few moments and placing my hands on my hips with a small huff. Okay, well, it couldn't have just grew a pair of legs and ran away. I muttered to myself and paused, chuckling, noticing that the thought in my head sounded a hell of a lot like Ellie's voice. Great, now she pokes fun at me and my thoughts. I chuckled to myself again. Young man. I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sound of a rather old male voice coming from behind me. I turned to see an elderly man, no younger than his 80s. His hair was basically all white like the snow from the north, with a few patches of darker gray showing that the man, once in his prime, had very dark black hair. His beard was patchy and unkempt, only a few hairs along the sides of his face to his sideburns. His mustache turned down into small handlebars. The edges white, while the middle along his upper lip was a dark gray, while his goatee struggled to maintain the last few hairs it had. His eyes were gentle and tired, a deep chocolate color, almost bordering on black in the light behind him. He lifted his hand to me, and in it, holding a rather old and familiar-looking baseball cap, the beige mesh back and the black canvas front, a patch on the front that looked like it could be easily ripped off saying, Established Taylor, 1974. Is this yours? I found it just down the path there. He stated without even motioning behind him or, come to think of it, without moving at all. Yes, thank you. I could have sworn I only set it down on the bench a moment ago. I stated honestly, having no reason to say anything more or anything less. The older man smiled as he extended his hand a little bit more. The action itself struck me as odd, as he leaned forward slightly as he did so. I carefully took my hat from his hands. Things are known to go missing out in these trails. Are you from around here? His question left me with a pause, but only for a moment. Born and raised, yes. Good. I won't take up much of your time. Enjoy the rest of your walk. Yes, you too, I stated with a smile, though the older man continued to stare at me for half a second before he simply turned and began walking back down the path that I had come from before. As he walked, though, it was glaringly obvious that he was in no way prepared to be walking this trail. 5 hours from either side of the trail, he wore a simple pair of khaki shorts, white sneakers, and a black and baby blue striped polo shirt. As he walked, he held his hands behind his back. No backpack, no supplies, no water. A part of me felt compelled to call out to him and offer some water, but it was something about his walk that deeply unsettled me. His cadence was strange. 1, 2, step. 1, 2, step. Like he was walking with a limp, but the limp wasn't visible. I shook my head for a moment and put my cap back on my head before I took a few steps back towards the bench, sitting down. When I looked up to the path again, the old man was gone. The interaction had left me unnerved, to say the least, and accompanied by the feeling I had gotten while leaving the house, I settled with the fact that I shouldn't linger. I reached over and grabbed my water and snacks, opened my pack and placed my snacks back inside before opening my water bottle, taking a good-sized swig to quench my thirst. I almost hadn't noticed how dry my mouth and lips had become until taking that drink. Closing my water bottle and placing it back inside the side pouch before opening the small front zipper pouch, taking out a silver cigarette case. The shiny metal had been scuffed over the years and no longer shined like it used to. Opening it, there was a single metal arm on a spring that used to keep the line of cigarettes together. Now it kept a small baggie of white ash in its place. I looked at the ash and sighed, lifting the arm and taking the small bag out of the case, closing it, holding the bag in the palm of my hand. I wish that you had told me sooner. Maybe there was something I could have done to help you be more comfortable in your final days. I wish so dearly that you were here to see the twins come into the world. I sighed heavily, closing my eyes for a moment. You were a real bastard sometimes, but I know that you loved me the best you could. And I know that you would have loved the twins with all you had. We don't know if we're having boys or girls or both. But while you're up there, do you mind watching over them? I miss you, Dad. I took a deep breath, opening the small baggie as the wind picked up, tipping it over and letting the ashes be taken by the wind and scatter along the dry, rolling hills. Letting the wind take the small plastic baggie with it. It did not feel right to keep any part of it. Standing still for a moment before placing the case back in my bag, before slipping the straps back over my shoulders, starting to head back down the path towards the trail entrance. Looking up to the sky for a moment, I frowned. The sky was darker than it should be. The bright clear blue had shifted to a dark tone. While some wispy clouds had occupied the sky, the setting sun causing the sky to seemingly explode in a sea of pastel colors. Sunset. The sun was setting at noon? I frowned, reaching into one of the accessory pockets along the waist of my pack. Taking out my GPS tracker, which I knew had the time on it, turning it on and letting it connect. It took a few moments too long before it beeped. The green map on the small screen showing up with the time in the top left. 6:35 p.m.? That can't be right. I looked around for a moment. The hills were starting to cast shadows, but there was no one else around. Holding the small GPS unit in my hand tightly, my walking pace that I had starting soon turned into a light and steady jog. If I kept up this pace, I could cut my travel time back by at least a quarter. Breathing steadily, controlled. Each step that brought me further away from the overlook, that feeling of anxiety from before started creeping back into my chest. There would be a stretch of trail where I would be in the middle of nowhere. My jog subconsciously had turned into a steady run, pack bouncing slightly on my shoulders as my breathing was heavy. I could hear the sound of tumbling rocks and sand from somewhere close. When my right foot went down on my next stride, it found nothing as the path had collapsed on my right side, causing me to keel over. My hands lifted to protect my head as I crashed down the side of the steep inclined hills. I felt the cold before anything else. The goosebumps that had traveled up both my arms, causing a deep-set, body-racking shiver to shoot down my spine. The pain that originated in my leg quickly spread. My eyes shot open abruptly as a scream ripped through my throat and echoed out into the valley hills around me. I choked back the scream and gritted my teeth, pushing myself up onto my elbows, the coarse dirt and rocks ripping out the skin of my already scratched up arms. My breathing was bordering on hyperventilation. I closed my eyes tightly and took a few slow, deep breaths before opening my eyes again. The sky around me was dark, far past sunset. The light from the nearby city and the moon illuminated the area around me enough to see nothing but shadows and far distant lights beyond the hills. Carefully forcing myself into a sitting position, looking down only to be greeted by my left leg from a quarter way above my ankle, bent off unnaturally to the side. Carefully rolling onto my hip, silencing the pained yelp that threatened to escape my lips. Grabbing my pocket knife from my back pocket, folding it open before with shaking hands, reaching forward and carefully cutting open my pant leg. Hesitantly pulling away the flaps of cut fabric. Nausea bubbled up in my throat, seeing the state of my leg. My tibia from a quarter of the way up from my ankle was snapped, but not cleanly. The snap was jagged and I could see bones sticking out of my skin. Oh God. Fuck. My eyes searched around for a moment, frantically looking for my pack. My eyes landed on it, some 10 or so feet from me. I took a few deep breaths before slowly orienting myself so my back was to it, using my hands to drag myself backwards. Every bump, movement, shift So much as a brush of something against my lower leg caused excruciating pain to spiderweb through my leg. Unable to silence the few cries that left my lips as I moved closer to my only lifeline. The distance felt like a marathon once I had completed it. Grabbing my pack and the set of hiking sticks from the side they were strapped to. One of them was already broken in 3 different places from the fall. Opening the pack and searching through it frantically for the bundle of paracord I had stashed. I set the cord down and grabbed the broken hiking stick, snapping the 2 larger ends apart completely as they were now hardly hanging together. Setting them down and looking at my leg, I had to reduce it. Reaching forward, my hand shaking as I hesitated. Come on, William. Fuck. Okay. Quickly but carefully grabbing my foot, I moved it back into what would be its normal position.
God, fuck.
But the scream that left my lips while doing so was sure to attract attention. My cry left my lips, as did the air from my lungs. I choked back a sputtering sob while placing the broken parts of the hiking stick on either side of my leg, my hands going for my belt, undoing the buckle and pulling it through the loops, wrapping it around just above my knee where the top of the broken sticks were, tightening it as much as I was able to keep them in place before grabbing the paracord, carefully and strategically wrapping it around the sticks and securing square knots. I held the end of the cord, took a few rapid deep breaths before tugging roughly, cinching the knots so they wouldn't slip. My yell turned into another choked cry. The nausea settled in again. I could do nothing but slump over to the side and spill what little contents were in my stomach before falling onto my back, closing my eyes. My body felt like it was on fire, but in an ice bath at the same time, listening to the silence around me. My eyes snapped open at the sound of a nearby snapping twig and the rustling of brush. Grabbing my pack and dragging it with me, I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to be silent while dragging my leg and body against the cold and jagged ground. Finding cover behind a large rock, pocket knife in one hand, I placed the other over my mouth to make sure no sound left my lips, listening to the sound of something approaching. Dirt and rocks were being dragged as it approached. A large, hunched, gray-like figure lumbered over to where I had been laying only moments before. It seemed to claw at the ground where some of my blood had surely saturated the dry dirt. The figure didn't look human, but it didn't even look like an animal. With its back hunched, I could make out the protruding vertebrae of its spine, emaciated. Its skin looked gray and sickly in the moonlight, and I could see what I could only describe as scattered strands of white hair along its head. Watching it sniff the dirt, it lifted its head, looking around. I forced my body to lower itself closer to the ground and out of sight of whatever the hell this creature was. Then, it stood. God, it must have been close to 8 feet tall. On both its legs, shoulders still hunched, spindly arms hanging by its sides. Limply, its hands hung as low as its knees. Its hands each could easily hold my skull in the palm, its fingers coming to a point in rough, jagged-like claws. Its head snapped in another direction before it looked to the sky and screamed. The sound hit my ears and the world flipped on its head. The ear-piercing sound was enough to burst eardrums. The scream I can only describe was like a banshee. When the sound stopped, the creature bolted off in the opposite direction of me, galloping on all 4 legs. I lowered my hands from my ears, only to feel my ears were wet. I lifted my fingertips to them before bringing my hands back in front of my face. Fresh blood on my fingertips, mixed with the dirt that had now collected under my nails. I looked up in the direction the creature had run off to. Fear had taken a hold of my tongue. I couldn't utter a sound in case that creature returned. I need to get out of here. I need to leave. Now. I'm being stalked. I can feel its eyes searching for me. I can hear its lumbering feet shift the dirt and rock only a few yards behind me. Beside me? No, in front of me. I can't tell where it's coming from. It's closing in. My arms are torn up from dragging myself, but I can't risk standing. I don't trust myself not to scream in pain. I can move faster this way. Safer. I can hide. I don't know how long I've been crawling. It feels like hours. I can see the entrance to the park. I can see the distant shape of my truck. Hope. A light. It's not too far. But neither is it. I can hear its raspy breathing. I'm hiding next to a large rock and under some brush. The brush is so dry every time I move, a twig or branch digs into my skin. My forearms are a bloody torn mess. I've lost feeling in my leg. I think I can make a break for it. Feeling the coarse dirt against the palm of my hands, the dirt under my fingernails. Carefully and as silently as possible, unclasping the chest strap of my pack. I'm going to run for it. If it grabs my pack, that will give me a few extra seconds to... I don't know. It might be enough. I will get home. I have to get home. Taking a few deep breaths, carefully and silently getting myself to my knee. Then my foot, using the rock as support. Frantically looking around for a moment before pushing myself forward with the rock into as much of a sprint as I could physically do. My splint gave me just enough support that I didn't crumble at the slightest amount of pressure, but the pain was excruciating. I could see the details of my truck now, seeing it parked just past the wooden gate. The feeling of hope was shattered at the sound of the banshee-like scream and the ever faster approaching quadruped creature. I grabbed the strap of my pack and slipped it from my shoulder, grabbing the other strap. I didn't know what else to do but stop in my tracks and use my momentum to use my pack as a blunt object. My pack at least 25 pounds. As I turned, I caught a glimpse of misty white eyes before my pack collided into its face. Letting go of the backpack, letting it fly into the side of the creature, I hit the ground. I scrambled to my feet. Every ounce of power and energy I had launched myself up and over the fence, hitting the ground full force on my shoulder, but I didn't stop. Flipping onto my back and scrambling away from the fence, wanting to get as much distance away from it as possible. My eyes met the creature. It stood, 8 feet tall, face like a decaying corpse left in the sun too long. Its teeth, human-like, its mouth curled into a snarl. Its misty eyes stared into mine, but it didn't move. It didn't cross the threshold out of the forest. I flinched when it moved, watching its large, emaciated form crouch and pick something up from the ground. It stood again, my hat in its hand, and watched me for a moment before it just turned around and walked away. I didn't stay any longer than I had to, making my way over to my truck, unlocking it, thanking whatever God lived under the sun that had started for the first time, putting as much space between me and that place as I could. I was sitting up in a hospital bed, looking at the boot on my leg as I sat in silence, reviewing everything that had happened in the last day when the door to my room burst open. Ellie rushed inside, tears in her eyes as she threw her arms around me and held me close.
Thank God you're okay. When you didn't come home last night, I was so worried. I called the ranger, but they said they couldn't search until morning. When the hospital called, I thought...
Hey, I'm okay. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close to me. Maybe a little too tightly, but the only thing keeping me together was her. The smell of her hair from the shampoo she uses, the sound of her voice. It was safe. I pulled away just enough to place a hand on her belly, sighing softly. A part of me felt like this had all just been a bad dream. Dehydration-induced hallucinations, maybe.
What did the doctor say? What exactly happened?
Trail collapsed, fell down into the valley, broke my tibia clean. They've got me in a boot right now with a few extra metal hardware and some screws. I'll be okay, but no more hiking for me. I chuckled to keep the mood light. I didn't want to think too much about that thing. Right then, the doctor came into the room, knocking on the door frame. "Hello, Mr. William. I'm Dr. Valeria with Ortho. I'm the one who did the surgery on your leg. I'd just like to go over a recovery plan with you. Oh, but before that, this was dropped off, saying it belonged to you." I watched in shock as the doctor placed my old baseball cap on the bedside table from the hospital bed. I looked up to the doctor. Who dropped it off? I thought I lost it. And to be honest, I'm not sure. One of the nurses just gave it to me. Let's go over your treatment plan. I held the doctor's gaze for a moment as Ellie held my hand, before something in the background caught my attention. Out of my bedroom window, I looked out into the hospital hallway by the nurse's station. Staring at me was the old man from the trail. Well, hats off to that story. Certainly was no walk in the park. Thank you for listening, and you can handle another story, right?